It was a late Thursday evening, and I had just wrapped up a long day at work. My office is about an hour's drive from my house, and the route I usually take is through a winding, forested area. This time of year, it gets dark early, and the narrow road was only dimly lit by my car's headlights. I remember it was unusually quiet that night, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every little noise. The hum of my engine, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the rhythmic thump of my tires against the road were all that broke the silence. I turned on the radio to fill the void, but it didn't help much. Static filled the car as I drove further into the wooded area, so I switched it off, leaving me alone with my thoughts. About halfway through my drive, I noticed a car pulled over to the side of the road. Its hazard lights were flashing, and a figure was standing next to it, waving frantically. My first instinct was to help. After all, it could be someone in real trouble. But a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach made me hesitant. I slowed down as I approached the car and rolled down my window slightly, keeping my doors locked. "Do you need help?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The man who had been waving stepped closer, but not too close. He looked disheveled, his clothes were dirty, and there was a desperate look in his eyes. "My car broke down," he said, his voice shaky. "I don't have any cell service. Can you give me a ride to the nearest gas station?" Something felt off. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing around nervously or the fact that his story didn't quite add up. My phone had service, and I was only a few miles away from the nearest town. I offered to call a tow truck for him instead. He hesitated, then shook his head. No, that won't be necessary. I just need a ride." I repeated my offer, saying it was safer for him to wait for professional help. At that point, he became agitated. "Please, just let me in the car," he insisted, stepping closer. His sudden change in demeanor sent a chill down my spine. I quickly rolled up my window and drove off, watching him in my rearview mirror. He stood there for a moment, staring after me, then started walking back towards his car. I kept an eye on my mirrors, half expecting him to follow me, but he didn't. I reported the incident to the police when I reached the town, giving them as many details as I could. They thanked me and said they'd send someone to check it out. The rest of the drive home was a blur. My mind raced with what-ifs. What if I had let him in the car? What if he had been dangerous? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but think about the man on the side of the road. I hoped he got the help he needed, but I was also grateful I trusted my instincts. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest situations are the ones we narrowly escape. It was a hot summer evening, and I had just finished a late shift at the hospital. Being a nurse, I was used to long hours, but tonight had been particularly exhausting. I decided to take a different route home to avoid the construction on my usual path. This detour led me through a more rural area, a quiet stretch of road lined with fields and the occasional farmhouse. As I drove, I noticed the gas gauge inching closer to empty. I mentally kicked myself for not refueling earlier and started scanning the horizon for a gas station. Finally, I spotted a small, old-fashioned station up ahead. It looked almost abandoned, with a single flickering light illuminating the worn-out pumps. I pulled in, relieved to see the faint glow of an open sign in the window. I got out of the car and began pumping gas. The night was eerily still, with no sounds except the hum of the pump and the distant chirping of crickets. I felt a slight unease, but I brushed it off, blaming it on fatigue. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a faint rustling sound coming from the edge of the nearby field. I turned around, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. The field stretched out into the night, cloaked in shadows. I told myself it was just an animal and continued pumping gas, but my heart was pounding. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable. As I finished and replaced the nozzle, the rustling sound came again, louder this time. I quickly turned to see a figure emerging from the darkness, moving towards me. My pulse quickened as I tried to make out who or what it was. The figure got closer, and I could see it was a man, his face obscured by a hood. "Hey there," he called out, his voice oddly calm. "Car trouble?" I shook my head, trying to hide my anxiety. "No, just getting gas," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm almost done." He continued to walk towards me, his pace slow but deliberate. "Mind if I ask you for a ride? My car broke down a few miles back, and I haven't seen anyone else for hours." Every instinct in my body screamed to get in my car and drive away. Something about his presence felt wrong, and the way he appeared out of nowhere unsettled me. "I'm sorry," I said quickly, "but I can't. I'm in a hurry." Without waiting for a response, I jumped into my car, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I glanced back and saw the man standing there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He didn't move, just stood there, staring as I pulled out of the gas station and sped down the road. I didn't slow down until I reached the safety of a well-lit area. My mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something sinister. When I got home, I reported the incident to the local authorities, giving them the location and description of the man. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept thinking about how vulnerable I had been, alone at that deserted gas station. The next morning, I learned from the news that a suspicious figure had been reported by several other people in the same area, and the police were investigating. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was to have trusted my instincts. It was a stark reminder that even in seemingly mundane situations, danger can be lurking just out of sight, waiting for an opportunity. It was the summer before my senior year of college, and I had the house to myself for 2 whole weeks. My parents were on an extended vacation in Europe, and my younger sister was away at camp. I was looking forward to some peace and quiet, a chance to relax and catch up on some much-needed rest and personal projects. The first few days were blissfully uneventful. I spent my time lounging around, binge-watching TV shows, and working on a painting I had neglected for months. The house was situated in a quiet suburb, far enough from the city to feel secluded but still within reach of civilization. I felt safe and comfortable, a far cry from the dorm life I was used to during the school year. One night, about a week into my solitude, I was curled up on the couch with a book when I heard a faint noise coming from outside. It sounded like someone walking on gravel. I paused, listening carefully, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I shrugged it off as an animal or a neighbor and went back to my book. A few nights later, I was awakened by a strange sound. It was a soft tapping, like fingernails lightly drumming on a window pane. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. The tapping continued for a few seconds and then stopped. I waited, but everything was silent again. I eventually convinced myself that it was just the house settling and went back to sleep. The following night, I was in the kitchen making a late-night snack when I heard it again. The same soft tapping, this time coming from the living room window. My heart raced as I tiptoed to the living room, peering out from behind the curtains. There was nothing there, just the dark, empty street illuminated by a lone streetlight. Feeling unnerved, I checked all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked and turned on a few more lights before heading back to bed. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and I kept waking up at the slightest sound. Over the next few days, the tapping continued sporadically. Sometimes it was at the living room window, other times at the back door. Each time I investigated, I found nothing. I began to feel like I was being watched, and the once cozy house now felt oppressive and eerie. One evening, I decided to call my friend Rachel. She lived nearby and often came over to hang out. I told her about the strange noises and how I was starting to feel uneasy. Rachel, always the practical one, suggested that it was probably just a prank or an animal. She offered to stay over for a few nights, which I gratefully accepted. Rachel arrived with her overnight bag and a determined look. We spent the evening watching movies and trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. Just as we were about to go to bed, the tapping started again, louder this time. Rachel's face went pale, and she looked at me with wide eyes. "Okay, that's definitely not an animal," she whispered. We both grabbed flashlights and walked to the living room, our steps cautious and deliberate. We turned off the lights so we could see outside better. The tapping continued, and I aimed my flashlight at the window. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow dart away, but it was so quick I couldn't be sure. "Did you see that?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," I replied, my own voice barely a whisper. We decided it was time to call the police. They arrived within minutes and did a thorough search of the property. They found nothing out of the ordinary, but they promised to patrol the area more frequently. Rachel and I thanked them and locked all the doors and windows once more. Rachel stayed with me for the next few nights, but the tapping didn't return while she was there. Eventually, she had to go back home, and I was alone again. The house felt even more oppressive after she left, and I found myself jumping at every little noise. One night, I woke up to a different sound, a faint scraping, like metal against metal. It was coming from the back door. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I whispered my address to the operator. The scraping stopped, but I could hear faint footsteps moving around the house. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they got there, the intruder was gone. They found scratch marks on the back door, evidence that someone had tried to pick the lock. The officer in charge advised me to stay with a friend until my parents returned and suggested installing a security system. I packed a bag and went to Rachel's place, too scared to stay another night alone. When my parents returned, we installed a security system and better locks. The police never caught the person who had been lurking around the house, and I never found out who it was or what they wanted. The experience left me shaken, and for a long time, I had trouble feeling safe in my own home. Even now, years later, I can't hear a tapping sound without feeling a chill run down my spine, a haunting reminder of those long, terrifying nights alone. Driving back from a family reunion one night, I found myself on a long stretch of rural highway. It was nearly midnight, and the road was deserted except for my car. The reunion had been in a small town a few hours away, and I was eager to get home and sleep in my own bed. The night was clear, the moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Fields and forests lined both sides of the road, and I occasionally saw a farmhouse light in the distance. I had my windows down, enjoying the cool breeze and the sound of crickets chirping in the night. After about an hour of driving, I noticed headlights approaching from behind. I glanced at my rearview mirror and saw a pair of bright lights gaining on me quickly. The car seemed to come out of nowhere, and within moments, it was tailgating me, its headlights almost blinding in my mirror. I sped up slightly, hoping the car would pass, but it stayed right on my bumper. Annoyed and a bit anxious, I changed lanes to let it overtake me, but instead of passing, it moved over and continued to follow closely. The headlights were so close now that they filled my car with an intense, white light. My heart started to race. There was no one else on the road, and I couldn't understand why this driver was behaving so aggressively. I decided to slow down and let them pass, but they matched my speed, staying right behind me. I thought about pulling over, but the idea of stopping on a dark, deserted highway with this strange car behind me made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm, reminding myself that panicking wouldn't help. I remembered a rest area a few miles ahead and decided to pull in there, hoping the other car would continue on. As I approached the rest area, I signaled and exited the highway, the car still tailing me. I pulled into a parking space near the entrance, where there were a few other cars and trucks parked. To my relief, the car sped past the rest area entrance and continued down the highway. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding and leaned back in my seat, trying to calm my racing heart. After a few minutes, I decided to get back on the road. I didn't want to stay in the rest area longer than necessary. As I merged back onto the highway, I kept a close eye on my rearview mirror, half expecting the car to reappear, but the road remained empty. Feeling a bit more at ease, I continued my drive. But about 20 minutes later, I saw headlights approaching again. My heart sank as I realized it was the same car, and it was gaining on me quickly. This time, I didn't wait for it to tailgate me. I took the next exit, which led to a small town I was vaguely familiar with. I drove through the quiet streets, taking random turns in an attempt to lose the car. I could see its headlights following me at a distance, but I managed to put some space between us. I pulled into a gas station, parked near the entrance, and went inside, hoping the car would pass by and leave me alone. The gas station attendant gave me a curious look as I walked in, probably wondering why I looked so shaken. I pretended to browse the shelves, keeping an eye on the parking lot. After a few tense minutes, the car drove past the gas station and continued down the road. I waited a bit longer before getting back in my car, making sure the coast was clear. When I finally felt it was safe, I got back on the highway, my nerves on edge. I drove the rest of the way home without incident, but the experience left me rattled. For weeks after that night, I found myself constantly checking my rearview mirror, hyper-aware of any cars that seemed to be following me too closely. The memory of those bright headlights and the feeling of being hunted on that dark, lonely highway haunted me for a long time. Even now, I can't drive down a deserted road at night without feeling a twinge of anxiety, a reminder of that unnerving encounter and the stranger who seemed to appear out of nowhere, intent on making my drive a living nightmare. I had been working the night shift at the hospital for about 6 months. The hours were long and the work was demanding, but I didn't mind. There was something calming about the hospital at night, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by a hushed stillness. I was a nurse in the emergency department, and while it was quieter at night, there were still moments of chaos when patients would come in with all sorts of emergencies. One night, I was assigned to the graveyard shift, starting at midnight and ending at 8 a.m. It was a slow night, the kind where time seemed to drag. Around 3 a.m., a patient came in with minor injuries from a car accident. After treating them, I decided to take a short break. I grabbed a cup of coffee from the vending machine and headed to the small staff room, which was tucked away in a quiet corner of the hospital. As I sat there sipping my coffee, I felt the fatigue of the night weighing on me. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the silence wash over me. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise coming from the hallway. It sounded like soft, shuffling footsteps. I opened my eyes and listened intently. The sound grew louder, but when I looked into the hallway, it was empty. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just one of the other night shift workers making their rounds. I finished my coffee and returned to the emergency department, where I found my colleague, Susan, reviewing patient charts. "Hey, did you hear someone in the hallway just now?" I asked her. Susan looked up, puzzled. "No, I didn't hear anything. It's been pretty quiet out here." I brushed off the eerie feeling and went back to my duties. An hour later, I was restocking supplies in one of the treatment rooms when I heard the noise again. The same shuffling footsteps, this time closer. I stepped out into the hallway, but again, it was empty. My unease was growing, but I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. As the night went on, the noises continued. Sometimes it was footsteps, other times it was a faint tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door. Each time I investigated, I found nothing. By 5 a.m., I was on edge, every small sound making my heart race. At one point, I went to check on a patient who had been admitted for observation. As I entered the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The patient's bed was empty, the sheets neatly folded, but I had just checked on them half an hour ago, and they had been sound asleep. I quickly checked the bathroom and nearby rooms, but there was no sign of them. I went back to the nurse's station and told Susan what had happened. She frowned and checked the patient log. "That's strange," she said. "There's no record of them being discharged or moved." We checked the security cameras and saw the patient walking down the hallway, but then they simply vanished from the footage. There were no exits nearby, and the idea of someone just disappearing into thin air was impossible to grasp. We alerted security, and a search of the hospital ensued, but the patient was never found. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, and by the time my shift ended, I was exhausted and deeply unsettled. A few days later, I learned that the area where I had heard the strange noises used to be part of the old psychiatric ward, which had been closed off years ago. Rumors among the staff suggested that some patients had suffered greatly in that ward, and stories of strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions were common. While I wasn't one to believe in the supernatural, the experience left a lasting impression on me. Every time I worked the night shift after that, I couldn't help but listen for those faint, shuffling footsteps and the mysterious tapping. I never heard them again, but the memory lingered, a chilling reminder of that eerie, unsettling night when the hospital's quiet became something far more sinister. I was in college working the night shift at a small, local diner to help pay for my tuition. The diner was open 24/7, and I usually worked from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The late hours meant that the customers were a mix of night owls, truck drivers, and the occasional group of college students pulling an all-nighter. One particular night, it was unusually quiet. It was around 2 a.m., and the diner was empty except for me and the cook, Joe. Joe was in the kitchen, prepping for the morning rush, and I was wiping down the counters and tables, trying to keep myself busy. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional sizzle from the kitchen were the only sounds breaking the silence. Just as I was finishing up, the bell above the door jingled, and a man walked in. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in a while. He had a nervous energy about him, constantly glancing over his shoulder as he made his way to the counter. "Hey there, what can I get you?" I asked, putting on my best customer service smile. "Coffee? Black," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted around the empty diner, never settling on anything for more than a few seconds. I poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him. "Here you go. Anything else?" He shook his head and took a sip, his hands trembling slightly. I tried to engage him in small talk, but he seemed more interested in the entrance, his eyes glued to the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. After a few minutes, another customer walked in, an older man with a weathered face and a gruff demeanor. He took a seat at the far end of the counter, not acknowledging the first man. I got him a cup of coffee as well and left them both to their own devices. Things seemed to settle down for a bit. I went back to cleaning, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over the diner. Suddenly, the first man stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. He looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Is there a back way out of here?" he asked urgently. I nodded, pointing to the door that led to the kitchen and the back exit. He didn't wait for me to say anything more. He bolted for the door, disappearing into the kitchen. I heard Joe shout in surprise as the man rushed past him and out the back door. The older man at the counter didn't react at all to the commotion. He just continued sipping his coffee, staring down at the counter. I walked over to him, feeling more than a little unsettled. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you know who that was?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I shook my head. "No, he just came in for some coffee and then ran out." The older man nodded slowly, as if processing this information. "He's been on the run for a while now. Dangerous man, they say." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" The man set his coffee down and looked me straight in the eye. "He's wanted for some serious crimes. You'd be best to forget you saw him." Before I could ask any more questions, the older man stood up, left some money on the counter, and walked out, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. I went into the kitchen to check on Joe, who was still a bit shaken by the sudden intrusion. We talked about what had happened, trying to make sense of it. Joe suggested we call the police, but I hesitated, unsure of what to tell them. In the end, we decided to keep an eye out and stay cautious. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the experience left me on edge. Every time the door jingled, I couldn't help but tense up, wondering if the mysterious man or someone looking for him would walk in. Over the next few days, I scoured the news for any mention of a fugitive, but I found nothing. The older man's warning echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something dangerous that night. I never saw either man again, but the memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder that even in the quietest places, danger can be just around the corner, waiting for the right moment to strike. Back when I was fresh out of college and just starting my first real job, I was looking for a cheap apartment to rent. I didn't have much money, so I turned to Craigslist to find something within my budget. After a few days of searching, I came across a listing that seemed almost too good to be true. A spacious one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood for a fraction of the price I was expecting. The ad was brief but promising, and the photos showed a clean, well-kept apartment. I contacted the poster, who identified himself as Mark, and arranged to meet him at the apartment to take a look. Mark seemed friendly enough over the phone, and we set up a time for the next evening. When I arrived at the address, I was pleased to see that the building looked just as nice as it had in the pictures. It was an older building with a lot of character, and the street was quiet and tree-lined. I walked up to the door and rang the bell. A moment later, a man in his late 30s opened the door. He was clean-cut, wearing casual clothes, and had a warm smile. "You must be Alex," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Mark. Thanks for coming out to take a look." I shook his hand and followed him inside. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and as we climbed the stairs, Mark made small talk, asking about my job and my interests. He seemed genuinely interested, which put me at ease. When we reached the apartment, Mark unlocked the door and gestured for me to enter. The place was just as advertised: spacious, clean, and with plenty of natural light. I walked around, taking in the living room, kitchen, and bedroom. Everything looked great, and I was starting to feel excited about the prospect of living here. "So, what do you think?" Mark asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. "It's perfect," I said, unable to hide my enthusiasm. "How soon could I move in?" Mark smiled. "I'm glad you like it. There's just one thing I need to mention. The last tenant left some furniture behind. If you don't mind keeping it, I can offer you a discount on the first month's rent." I looked around. The furniture was in good condition and fit the space well. "I don't mind at all," I said. "That sounds like a great deal." "Excellent," Mark said. "I'll need a deposit and the first month's rent up front. You can fill out the lease agreement now if you're ready." I hesitated for a moment, but everything seemed legitimate, and the apartment was such a great find that I decided to go for it. I filled out the paperwork, handed over the money, and Mark gave me the keys. We agreed that I would start moving in over the weekend. On Saturday morning, I arrived at the apartment with a car full of boxes. As I was unloading, I noticed an elderly woman watching me from a window in the building across the street. She seemed to be staring intently, which made me a little uncomfortable, but I brushed it off as curiosity about the new tenant. By the end of the day, I had moved most of my belongings into the apartment. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the couch that had been left behind and decided to call it a night. As I was drifting off to sleep, I thought I heard a faint knocking sound. I sat up and listened, but everything was silent. Figuring it was just the old building settling, I went to bed. The next day, I was unpacking in the living room when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find the elderly woman from across the street standing there. She looked concerned. "Hello," I said. "Can I help you?" She peered at me with a serious expression. "You're the new tenant?" "Yes, I just moved in yesterday," I replied. She shook her head. "You need to be careful. The man who rented you this apartment, Mark, is not the owner. He's been doing this to people for months." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" "He finds vacant apartments, poses as the landlord, and rents them out. When the real owners come back, they find someone living here who shouldn't be." I felt a wave of panic. "But he gave me keys, and everything seemed so legitimate." The woman sighed. "He's very convincing. You should contact the real landlord as soon as possible." After she left, I spent hours trying to track down the true owner of the apartment. Eventually, I found the contact information for the property management company. When I called them, my worst fears were confirmed. They had no record of Mark and told me that the apartment was supposed to be empty until new tenants moved in next month. Feeling like an idiot, I packed up my things and moved out that same day. I tried calling Mark's number, but it was disconnected. I had been scammed, and there was nothing I could do about it. The police took my report, but they warned me that these types of scammers were hard to catch. The experience left me shaken and mistrustful. I ended up finding a more legitimate apartment through a rental agency, but I always made sure to double-check everything from then on. It was a harsh lesson, but one I would never forget. To this day, I can't look at Craigslist apartment listings without feeling a twinge of anxiety, a reminder of how easily I was duped by someone who seemed so trustworthy. I had been looking forward to the fishing trip for weeks. My friend Jake and I had planned a weekend getaway to a remote cabin by a lake deep in the woods. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape from our hectic city lives, a chance to unplug and unwind. We left early on a Friday morning, our car packed with gear and supplies. The drive took several hours, winding through increasingly narrow and rugged roads. By the time we arrived at the cabin, it was late afternoon. The place was perfect, rustic and isolated, with a stunning view of the lake. We quickly unpacked and set up our fishing gear, eager to hit the water. That evening, we paddled out in a small rowboat, casting our lines into the calm, glassy surface of the lake. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the soft splash of our paddles and the distant calls of birds. It felt like we were a million miles away from everything. As the sun began to set, we decided to head back to the cabin. The fish hadn't been biting much, but we didn't mind. We cooked a simple dinner over a campfire, chatting and laughing late into the night. Eventually, the long day caught up with us, and we turned in, excited for a full day of fishing the next day. The next morning, we were up with the sunrise. The lake was shrouded in mist, and the forest was eerily quiet. We grabbed our gear and headed back out on the water. As the hours passed, we had more luck than the previous day, catching several decent-sized fish. It was shaping up to be a perfect weekend. Around midday, we decided to try our luck at a different spot across the lake. We rowed to a secluded cove surrounded by thick trees. It felt like our own little secret fishing spot. We cast our lines and settled in, enjoying the peace and quiet. After a while, I started to feel a bit drowsy. The gentle rocking of the boat and the warm sun made it hard to stay awake. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the rhythmic sounds of the water lapping against the boat. I must have dozed off, because I was jolted awake by a sudden, sharp tug on my fishing line. I grabbed my rod and began to reel in, feeling a strong resistance. "Got one!" I shouted to Jake, who was also reeling in his line. As I pulled the fish closer to the boat, I realized it was bigger than anything we had caught so far. I stood up, trying to get a better angle, when suddenly, the line went slack. I cursed under my breath, thinking the fish had gotten away. But then I saw something in the water that made my blood run cold. There, just beneath the surface, was a pale, human-like face staring up at me. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, nearly tipping the boat, and the face disappeared into the depths. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake looked at me, alarmed. "What did you see?" I quickly recounted what I had seen, but even as I said the words, they sounded unbelievable. Jake looked skeptical, but he could see I was genuinely shaken. We decided to head back to the cabin, the joy of fishing now overshadowed by a sense of unease. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the face in the water. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of hallucination brought on by the combination of sun and exhaustion? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something sinister lurking beneath the surface of the lake. The next day, we packed up our gear and left earlier than planned. The peaceful escape we had hoped for had been marred by the unsettling experience. As we drove back to the city, I kept replaying the incident in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Weeks later, I did some research on the area and found out that the lake had a dark history. Decades ago, there had been a tragic accident where a boat had capsized during a storm, and several people had drowned. Their bodies had never been recovered. The knowledge didn't bring me any comfort. If anything, it made the experience even more chilling. To this day, I avoid fishing in remote lakes, and whenever I hear the soft lapping of water, I can't help but feel a shiver run down my spine, remembering the haunting face that stared up at me from the depths. It was a rainy Saturday evening, and I found myself alone at home. My roommate was out of town for the weekend, so I decided to relax with a good movie and some takeout. As the rain pattered against the windows, I settled onto the couch with a plate of Chinese food and my phone. I was halfway through the movie when I got a Snapchat notification. It was from an account I didn't recognize, with the username TheWatcher123. I hesitated for a moment, considering just ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the snap. The screen displayed a photo of my apartment building taken from outside, in the rain. My heart skipped a beat. I double-checked the username to see if it was someone I knew playing a prank, but it didn't ring any bells. A sense of unease crept over me. Who would be sending me a picture of my building? I quickly snapped a photo of my living room and sent a message. "Who is this?" Almost immediately, I received another snap. This one was a photo of the hallway just outside my apartment door. Panic started to set in. I locked all the doors and windows, checking them twice. My mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be a prank? Or was someone really watching me? I decided to call the police, but before I could dial, another snap came in. This one was a photo taken through the peephole of my front door, showing my living room from the perspective of the hallway. My stomach turned. Whoever this was, they were just outside my door. I grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked through the peephole, but there was no one there. I considered my options. I could wait for the police to arrive, or I could confront whoever was out there. The idea of confronting them terrified me, but I couldn't just stand there doing nothing. Taking a deep breath, I flung open the door, knife in hand. The hallway was empty, but there was a fresh puddle of rainwater on the floor, leading away from my door and down the stairs. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me, and called the police, explaining the situation as clearly as I could through my panic. While waiting for the police to arrive, I received another snap. This time it was a video. With trembling hands, I opened it. The video showed the person walking down the stairs and out the front door of the building. The last frame was a close-up of my apartment number. The message attached simply read, "I'll be seeing you." The police arrived shortly after and took my statement. They searched the building and the surrounding area but found no one. The officer in charge advised me to stay somewhere else for the night and promised to keep a patrol car in the area. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every noise and constantly checking my phone. Thankfully, there were no more messages. The next day, I contacted Snapchat support to report the incident and provide the username of the sender. They assured me they would look into it, but I never heard back about any results from their investigation. I moved out of the apartment a few weeks later, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The experience left me paranoid and anxious, and I stopped using Snapchat altogether. To this day, the identity of the Watcher 123 remains a mystery, but the memory of that rainy night and the terrifying snaps is something I will never forget. A few years ago, I was on a dating app trying to meet new people. I matched with a guy named Eric who seemed friendly and interesting. We chatted for a few days, and he suggested we meet up for dinner at a popular restaurant downtown. I agreed, excited to finally meet him in person. The day of our date, I made sure to tell my roommate where I was going and with whom, just to be safe. Eric and I had agreed to meet at 7 p.m. When I arrived at the restaurant, he was already there, waiting at a table. He looked just like his photos, and his smile put me at ease immediately. Dinner was great. We talked about our jobs, hobbies, and interests. Eric was charming and funny, and the conversation flowed easily. As the night went on, I felt more and more comfortable around him. He suggested we take a walk after dinner to continue our conversation, and I agreed. We strolled through the nearby park, enjoying the cool evening air. The park was well lit and had a fair number of people walking around, so I felt safe. We sat down on a bench by a small pond, still chatting and laughing. Everything was going well until Eric's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at his phone, and his expression changed. He seemed tense and distracted. I asked if everything was okay, and he brushed it off, saying it was just a work thing. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the mood had shifted. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed again. He checked it and looked even more agitated. I asked if he needed to take care of something, and he apologized, saying he had to make a quick call. He walked a few steps away, speaking in a low voice. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but his tone was urgent. When he came back, he seemed distracted and distant. I asked if everything was all right, and he assured me it was fine, but suggested we call it a night. I agreed, thinking he was just stressed about work. He offered to walk me to my car, which was parked a few blocks away. As we walked, I noticed a man following us at a distance. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but as we turned corners and crossed streets, he stayed behind us. My heart started to race, and I whispered to Eric that I thought we were being followed. He glanced back and quickened his pace, urging me to do the same. We reached my car, and Eric insisted on checking the back seat before letting me in. Once I was safely inside, he told me to lock the doors and drive straight home. I did as he said, watching him in the rearview mirror as he walked back toward the restaurant. When I got home, I texted Eric to let him know I was safe. He replied quickly, saying he was glad I was okay and that he had taken care of the situation. I asked what he meant, but he didn't elaborate. He just said it was best if we didn't see each other again. Confused and a little scared, I decided to do some digging. I searched Eric's name online and found out that he had a history of shady dealings and was possibly involved in some criminal activities. I realized that the man following us might have been someone from Eric's past, and I had unknowingly gotten caught up in something dangerous. The experience left me shaken and wary of online dating. I deleted my dating app profile and decided to take a break from dating altogether. It took a long time for me to feel comfortable meeting new people again. To this day, I'm much more cautious and always make sure to take extra precautions when meeting someone new. The memory of that night and the fear I felt still lingers, a constant reminder to always be vigilant and trust my instincts. A couple of years ago, I lived in a small, quiet neighborhood just outside of town. My parents were out of town for the weekend, and I had the house to myself. I was looking forward to a peaceful weekend, catching up on some reading and enjoying the solitude. Friday night came, and I settled in with a good book and a cup of tea. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. It had been raining heavily earlier in the day, but now the storm had passed, leaving the night cool and still. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head to bed. I made sure all the doors and windows were locked, then climbed the stairs to my room. I turned off the lights and slipped under the covers, feeling the comforting weight of my blanket. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. I lay still, listening. At first, I thought it was the rain or wind that had disturbed me, but then I heard it again, a soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from downstairs. I checked the time, 2:15 a.m. My heart started to race as I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling. But the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I got out of bed and tiptoed to the top of the stairs, straining to hear where the noise was coming from. The tapping seemed to be coming from the kitchen. I took a deep breath and quietly descended the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. When I reached the bottom, the tapping stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the house was silent. I slowly made my way to the kitchen and flipped on the light. The room was empty, but as I stood there, I noticed the back door was slightly ajar. I could have sworn I locked it before going to bed. My stomach dropped. Someone could be in the house. I quickly locked the door and checked the windows again. Everything seemed secure. I tried to shake off the unease and went back upstairs, telling myself it was just my imagination. I crawled back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next night, I decided to stay up a bit later, hoping exhaustion would help me sleep more soundly. Around midnight, I was watching TV in the living room when I heard it again. The same soft tapping. This time, it seemed to be coming from the front of the house. I muted the TV and listened carefully. The tapping was faint but unmistakable. It sounded like it was coming from the front door. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept towards the door. I peered through the peephole, but the porch was empty. Summoning my courage, I opened the door a crack and looked out. The night was still and quiet, with no sign of anyone. I stepped outside, scanning the yard and the street beyond. Nothing. I went back inside, double-checked the locks, and returned to the living room. Feeling unnerved, I decided to call it a night and head to bed. As I climbed the stairs, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was coming from one of the windows in the living room. I turned back, my heart in my throat, and walked over to the window. Peering through the curtains, I saw a shadowy figure standing just outside, their face obscured by the darkness. I froze, my mind racing with fear. The figure didn't move, just stood there, tapping on the glass. I couldn't make out any details, but the sight of them filled me with dread. I quickly turned off the lights, hoping they hadn't seen me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator about the intruder. They assured me that a patrol car was on its way and told me to stay on the line. As I waited for the police, the tapping stopped. I peeked through the curtains again, but the figure was gone. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety, wondering if they had left or were hiding somewhere nearby. The police arrived within minutes, searching the yard and the surrounding area. They found no sign of the intruder, but they promised to keep an eye on the neighborhood for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep at all, jumping at every sound and shadow. The next morning, I called my parents and told them everything. They decided to cut their trip short and come home that day. When they arrived, we installed additional locks and security cameras around the house. I never did find out who the intruder was or what they wanted, but the experience left me deeply unsettled. Even now, years later, the memory of those nights still haunts me. Whenever I'm home alone, I can't help but remember the tapping and the shadowy figure outside the window. It's a reminder to always stay vigilant and trust my instincts.